This episode is part of the EUTERPE podcast series on European literatures and gender from a transnational perspective.
This is a very special evening for us, and I'll soon tell you why. I have a very special privilege, and I have a huge joy to introduce to you tonight our speaker, Professor Rebecca Walkowitz, who is a Clerto Professor of English and Provost and Dean of the Faculty at Barnard College. Her research and teaching consider aspects of cosmopolitanism, multilateralism, and multilingualism, and their relationship to questions of idiom, narrative structure, typography, and media in modernist and contemporary literature. She is interested in how writers and artists create novels, poems, essays, films, and digital compositions that are intended for global audiences, and how the multilingual features of those works, the way they begin in translation or appear simultaneously in multiple languages, can help us think about the global dimensions of local, regional, and national communities, including the university community. Walkowitz is author of two extremely important books: Born Translated, the contemporary novel in an age of world literature, which was published in 2015, and Cosmopolitan Style, Modernism Beyond the Nation, published in 2006. Born Translated builds a much-needed framework for understanding translation's effect on fictional works, as well as digital art, avant-garde magazines, literary anthologies, and visual media. Artists and novelists discussed include, and there is a long list I'll just mention, for example, Jamaica Kincaid, Kazuo Ishiguro, David Mitchell, and it goes up to Yang Hai Cheng Heavy Industries. The book understands that contemporary literature begins at once in many places, in engaging in a new type of social embeddedness and political solidarity. It recasts literary history as a series of convergences and departures, and by elevating the status of Born Translated, the concept that some of you have used in your research and many of you will be using probably, works redefines common conceptions of author, reader, and the nation. And in Cosmopolitan Style, a broad-ranging intervention with the debates over the politics, ethics, and aesthetics of cosmopolitanism, Walkowitz argues that modernist literary style has been crucial to new ways of thinking and acting beyond the nation. Rebecca Walkowitz has been the editor of 8 additional edited volumes, including Bad Modernism, co-edited with Douglas Mao in 2006, Immigrant Fictions, Contemporary Literature in an Age of Globalization, 2007, and The New Vocabulary for Global Modernisms, co-edited with Eric Hale in 2016. She has also written several widely cited and field-defining articles, including The New Modernist Studies in 2008, and co-authored with Douglas Mao, and an article which helped describe and set a new agenda for the field of modernist studies, and is one of the most cited articles in the flagship journal PMLA. Professor Walkowitz is currently writing the new Multilingualism, Knowing and Not Knowing Languages and Literature, Culture, and the Classroom, forthcoming from Columbia University Press, which calls for new ways of counting, organizing, and valuing world languages both within and outside the university, and traces of emergence of historically new examples of multilingual art and entertainment. And I want to add here that I just recently discovered all of this is not my wisdom. I got it from other sources. But I just want to add here that I suppose she will be addressing in that book more the concept that I have just discovered reading her article of postlingualism, which is very challenging and brings a new perspective to thinking about it. Postlinguism, actually. Sorry, I have to correct myself. So postlinguism, which is bringing a very new and provocative dimension to thinking about multilingualism, various languages, issues of translation, and reading literary texts. So all of these fields of interest and topics of interest are obviously very close to the heart of EUTERPE, but I know that many of them are very important and close to the hearts of you who are not working immediately in literary studies. And I just want to add that among many recognitions and awards that Professor Walkowitz has earned in her life, I just want to mention a couple of them. She has served as a president of the Modernist Studies Association in 2014-15. She was a senior research fellowship at Freie University Berlin, Board of Trustees Award for Excellence in Research from Rutgers University, and Walter Jackson Bale Fellowship. She got Walter Jackson Bale Fellowship in World Literature at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard. Having said that, I want to add something very special. We are very, very grateful for Professor Walkowitz to come tonight and speak to us within this framework of Susan Stanford Friedman Memorial Lecture Series. This lecture series has been established after the unfortunate death of Susan Friedman, an outstanding scholar who has profoundly shaped the field of both literary studies and women and gender studies. Susan Friedman was professor of English and Women's Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and among her many influential volumes are, I'll mention just two, Mappings, Feminism, and the Cultural Geographies of Encounter, published in 1998, and Planetary Modernisms, Provocations on Modernity Across Time, from 2015. Among her many awards, Professor Susan Friedman was awarded Wayne C. Booth Award for Lifetime Achievements in Narrative Studies. But within EUTERPE, we remember Susan Friedman not only as a scholar who influenced strongly work of many of us, but as a very close friend, and also as a person who was a strong supporter of EUTERPE and who was a member of our advisory board from the beginning. Unfortunately, very soon after the project started, we heard that Susan was sick. Soon after that, she has died. And our wonderful program coordinator, Dr. Petra Bakos, has came immediately with the suggestion that we institutionalize this memorial lecture series, which everybody supported. We really took it immediately and wholeheartedly accepted the idea, which was developed as a part of our program. So every summer school has a special lecturer who is coming to give a lecture in honor of Susan Friedman. This is the third one. We hope in the end to have a volume in honor of Susan Friedman. And today I am particularly honored to have Rebecca. And now I'm intentionally using her first name because I want to say that Rebecca was a personal friend with Susan Friedman. So ties are multiple here. In a sense, her spirit may be somewhere around here, invoked by our love and appreciation for her. So Rebecca Walkowitz is going to talk today, I think, bringing back certain ideas and bringing us back some of her thinking. The topic of her talk is, as it was on a board and now it's not anymore, but it will be back, Reshuffling, Feminist Collaboration, and Transnational Solidarity. Rebecca, please.
It is an enormous pleasure to be here with you today. As Jasmina knows, being in person is extremely important to me. Those of us, all of us who lived through the COVID period, remember what it was like to be separated, to be interacting only by screen, to have lost the opportunity for all of those spontaneous, serendipitous things that happen on the shoulders of conversation before and after the click of the Zoom screen that we can benefit from when we're here in person. I also think that conversation is really an embodied experience. It's a moment, as I've written elsewhere, in which we are breathing together and have opportunities for forms of inspiration that we would not have otherwise. So I'm glad to have this opportunity. I want to say thank you to my hosts, the CEU and EUTERPE, for bringing me, for being here with joy and with seriousness on this occasion. And so many thanks to Jasmina, who has been my host from the beginning, providing me with advice and instructions about how I get here, and then being such a welcoming host once I arrived. So thank you. I'm especially happy to be here to speak to you in honor of Susan Stanford Friedman, who had such a deep commitment to networks of feminist collaboration and transnational solidarity. I'm also honored to be among what I know are so many of Professor Friedman's cherished European collaborators. Today is September 11th, and Susan would have wanted us to take a moment, as I will now, to note the symbolism of the date known as 9/11 in the US. I believe she would have asked us to recommit ourselves to the intellectual and ethical work of cosmopolitan hospitality and multilateral engagement. She would have recognized with frustration and renewed commitment the rising tide of xenophobia, gender-based violence, and nationalist extremism. I ask that we take a moment now to pause with affection and with solemnity to register the transnational solidarity, both existing and aspirant, that events like this one represent. Animated by the legacy of Friedman's scholarship and the experiments in mixed genre and methodologies she employed in her mature work, I will be sewing together several critical and creative voices, as well as voices that are, like all voices, not entirely my own. The personal, the social, the analytic, the elegiac, the political, and the literary all have a place here. I learned that from Susan Friedman, whom I knew as a mentor, a scholar, a teacher, an academic leader, a colleague, and a friend. She combined these roles and these voices in her work, and I will be combining them here. Oh, thought Clarissa, in the middle of my party, here's death, she thought. In many of Virginia Woolf's novels, death comes at the start or in the middle of the story, but the story never ends with death. Woolf's fiction ends with gatherings of friends, families, colleagues, and strangers, including people who were once close but haven't seen each other for years. Painful loss interrupts, modifies, and transforms these gatherings, but it does not extinguish their impact or their capacity to provide comfort and vision. Death also occasions new thought, as in this passage from Mrs. Dalloway, in which Clarissa is startled into reflection, strong feeling, and insight. Oh, thought Clarissa, in the middle of my party, here's death, she thought. Thinking about death in the middle of a party leads Clarissa, leads us, to consider both the grave opportunity and the necessary conditions of survival. Those who survive will need to reject emotional isolation, inauthentic social ties, and merely customary allegiances. For survival, we will need to reanimate lost connections, re-engage with communities, and recognize the relationships that truly matter. What Sally felt was simply this. She had owed Clarissa an enormous amount. They had been friends, not acquaintances, friends. And she still saw Clarissa all in white going about the house with her hands full of flowers. I saw Susan for the last time on February 18th, 2023. I knew when I visited decided that we would not see each other again. We talked for 2.5 hours in her living room, mostly about the manuscript she had just finished, Sisters of Scheherazade, and which together with Venkat Mani, we were readying for publication. Susan asked me about my research and my work as a dean. She asked about my family, and we talked about that. But mostly we talked about writing, being read, and life within and for an institution. That was a party for us. And this today, an intellectual gathering, that was her idea of a really good time. In her last substantive email to me, she wrote kindly, warmly, "I have so appreciated all the work we have done together over the years." That was the highest compliment from Susan, her greatest expression of friendship, and I recognized all that she meant by work. Susan Stanford Friedman taught me an enormous amount about feminist labor. She taught me about institutional service and leadership. Early in my career, she was my colleague, my chair, my generous and frank reader, and my editor. She introduced the proposal for my first book to Columbia University Press, which eventually published that book and 2 others. Later in my career, we served together as trustees and executive board members of the Modernist Studies Association. We exchanged articles and drafts of articles. We first met in Madison, Wisconsin, but over the years we lectured, taught, and discussed, often over meals and drinks, in many other places, including New York, Boston, Seattle, Birmingham, and Seoul. Susan liked to travel, and me too. She would have loved to be with us here today. Susan's service to her colleagues, her university, our field, and the profession at an international scale was staggering. I don't mean simply that she held a very large number of time-consuming leadership roles, though she did. She reached out through citations in her criticism and lectures, and through meaningful acts of solidarity and incipient friendship, such as sending hard-to-acquire books or articles through the international mail, to an enormous number of young scholars throughout the world, especially women scholars. The bibliography and footnotes of her essays offer deep narratives of the field. Who learned from whom? Who differs from whom? Whose voices, read together, can move us forward? Friedman excelled in collating voices that had not been placed together before, and in reminding us, or showing us for the first time, who has contributed and what the impact has been. She understood the impact of collating and the way curating and comparing could animate new ideas and create new opportunities for agency and expression. It wasn't only ideas she brought together, it was people and collectives, colleagues, students, and friends, a conference, a classroom, a meeting. All of these were spaces of experiment and pleasure, determination, and self-transformation for others, as well as for herself. Every time she gave a party, she had this feeling of being something not herself, and that everyone was unreal in one way, much more real in another. It was, she thought, partly their clothes, partly being taken out of their ordinary ways, partly the background. It was possible to say things you couldn't say anyhow else, things that needed an effort, possible to go much deeper. Through her writing and her pedagogy, Susan Friedman knew how to sew things together. First one thing, then another. She did not always play the role of Mrs. Dalloway. Like the novel's peripheral Italian hat maker and passionate observer, Lucretia Warren Smith, Susan built things up. She had an art for that and so much determination. She knew how to turn grief into a catalyst for action, stitching the parts but not losing the texture of the pieces, making something new out of comparison. This was Susan's signature methodology. She showed how and what she learned, and she purposefully stretched the archive of modernist studies, women's writing, and transnational studies, and periodically reshaped their parameters. Sometimes she expressed disagreement and criticism about where these fields have been and how they were progressing. But above all, she circulated ideas and networks of ideas, creating a platform for others within her own well-established platform. Reading her recent work and rereading past work, I'm drawn to the models of collaboration, histories of institutional access, and reflections on the conditions of intellectual labor that appear and reappear in Friedman's themes and examples. My encounter with Friedman's writing began before we met, with her path-breaking essay on Woolf's internationalism, which I read in her 1998 book Mappings, Feminism and the Cultural Geographies of Encounter. In that essay, Friedman tells us about Alice Walker's reading of Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own, which Walker published in her 1974 book In Search of Our Mother's Gardens. Friedman repeats Walker's strategy of reading backward in order to move forward. We encounter Friedman in 1998, reading and analyzing Walker from 1974, reading and in fact rewriting Woolf from 1929. Friedman writes, echoing Toni Morrison, where are the geopolitical ghosts in Woolf's texts, and how do they haunt them? By way of example, this is Friedman, I want to suggest some uncommon readings of Woolf's metonyms in A Room of One's Own that are so commonly read solely in relation to gender. The food at Oxbridge and Furnham, the 500 pounds a year, and A Room of One's Own, all most surely instances of the local, but containing all often unacknowledged gestures of the geopolitical and transnational. Inspired by Morrison, Friedman turns to Walker's rewriting of Woolf to register the comparative history of ownership, as in A Room of One's Own, in which a woman born or made a slave, that's Walker, would have faced much more daunting material conditions, being owned rather than not having the capacity to own, than the middle-class women whom Woolf imagines in her essay. In one such passage, this is Friedman, in one such passage, Walker writes, Virginia Woolf wrote further, speaking of course not of our Phyllis, Wheatley, that any woman born with a great gift in the 16th century, insert 18th century, insert Black woman, insert born or made a slave, would certainly have gone crazed. Friedman then writes, these sharp juxtapositions both testify to Walker's indebtedness to Woolf and inscribe a racial critique that makes visible the degree to which Woolf's image of a writer's freedom depends upon the unacknowledged enslavement of others. Walker's reading is critical and also creative, as Friedman points out, because Walker inserts her own words into Woolf's sentences, highlighting Woolf's claims about how impossible it would have been to be a woman writer in the 16th century, while also supplementing and transforming this point, mixing in how much more impossible it would have been to be a woman writer who was born or made a slave, and noting, and this is Friedman noting what Walker implies, that Woolf is blind to the networks of capital that make one woman's economic independence reliant on the funds generated by another woman's bondage. Please notice here that Friedman, following Walker, retains rather than replaces Woolf's words. Friedman cites Walker, citing and amending Woolf to point out that when we talk about Woolf's transnationalism, we need to go well beyond the question of the novelist's movement through geopolitical space, or the origin of the writers who inspired her or whom she inspires, or even her diegetic representation of multiple nations or national characters. Instead, Friedman urges us to consider how global systems of exploitation create the conditions for individual achievement, including Woolf's. She also asks us to consider the converse, how imagined collaborations among women writers across time, episodes of shared labor that include critique as well as homage, create new opportunities for transnational solidarity. The model of solidarity here involves non-homogenizing friendship, connection, inspiration, but not sameness or even unequivocal affirmation. The philosophers might call this hospitality. Put another way, Friedman uses Walker's engagement with Woolf not simply to emphasize how Woolf's work has traveled internationally or shaped later writing, for example, her influence on African-American writing in the 20th century. She uses Walker's engagement to emphasize how Walker's strategic disruption of Woolf's essay across time and geography reveals geopolitical systems of exploitation and indivisibility, and an incomplete solidarity that Friedman is now, through her own work, seeking to remedy. It is Friedman's project here to enhance the visibility of Walker's intervention, as well as the historical blindness that Walker identifies in Woolf. Friedman credits Walker's analysis, although the crediting is Friedman, with giving us the opportunity to reflect on the histories of slavery and colonialism that contributed to the educational institutions whose exclusion of women Woolf laments. Surfacing Walker with Woolf, Friedman is therefore creating a larger ambit for Woolf's understanding of the conditions of feminist labor, that proverbial room of one's own that a writer or intellectual needs to have any chance of success. Friedman is modeling a more thorough, more historical, and more transnational vision of feminist collaboration. One might even say a more genuinely collaborative version, because it is less idealizing of individual accomplishment. It is, in that sense, more genuinely collaborative and more transnational than Woolf herself was able to imagine. And I'll have more to say about individualism in a moment. What I find remarkable, looking back at Friedman's 1998 essay, is its prescience, first, about the new ways we would come to think about the location of a literary text, and second, its prescience about the major role, after years and years of minor treatment, that Woolf's work would play in the scholarship on war, cosmopolitanism, colonialism, and transnational literary networks that began to appear in the early 2000s, including in my own book, Cosmopolitan Style. Looking forward to 2010 and 2020, it's remarkable how Friedman's focus on rereading and rewriting chimes with the work of scholars thinking about collaborative criticism, the circulation and remediation of modernism, and the pathways and impediments to choosing and possessing words. Fast forward 2 decades. In 2019, Friedman picked up the thread of her analysis of Walker's rewriting of Woolf to discuss in 2 essays the British multimedia artist Kaveh Wilson's reordering of the same Woolf text, A Room of One's Own. Wilson draws the title of his 2014 work, Of One Woman or So, by Olivia Nogofri, from an anagram of Woolf's essay and name. His artwork, which he presented in a performance he called The Dreadlock Host, uses all the words that Woolf used, and only those words, to create a new narrative about economic opportunity, colonialism, and creativity. As many of you will know, by calling his performance the Dreadlock Hoax, Wilson echoes and interrupts the infamous Dreadnought hoax, the takedown of the British Royal Navy, which was organized and performed by Woolf and her friends in 1910. You'll have to read Friedman's essays to get the full story about Wilson's amazing multi-genre artwork. But the part I want to mention here is Wilson's revision and stretching of Woolf's claims about gender and institutional space to include claims about class, race, colonialism, and sexuality, and in particular to emphasize, as Walker did, Woolf's complicity in the forgetting of those differences and of the systems of exclusion in which women are actors as well as victims. To be sure, systemic inequality and relative visibility are topics that Woolf knows and teaches well in other contexts. Apart from Mrs. Dalloway and A Room of One's Own, we might recall her discussion of Arthur's Education Fund in her book-length essay, 3 Guineas, published in 1938. Arthur's Education Fund, or AEF, as it appears in the Family Ledger, comes from William Makepeace Thackeray's novel Pendennis, and encapsulates the inequitable practice of family economy, in which the education of daughters is neglected in proportion and in service to the education of sons. Addressing educated men, Woolf writes, "From the Pastons to the Pendennises, all educated families from the 13th century to the present moment have paid money into that account. It is a voracious receptacle. And to this your sisters made their contribution." Woolf offers 2 structural lessons in 3 Guineas, echoing Walker and Wilson with a difference. Whatever Arthur achieved through his education and good clothes and excellent meals and books, he did not achieve alone. Worse, others achieved less or had fewer opportunities to achieve so that he could learn and flourish. By drawing attention to exclusions based on class as well as gender, to histories of colonial exploitation, and to contemporary racism, Walker's and Wilson's rewriting of Woolf's writing remediates as well as honors Woolf's insights. Friedman wants us to see how the later artists are recycling, renewing, and repurposing, rather than canceling, dismissing, or simply surpassing Woolf. Thinking about literary history, the legacies of feminist modernism, and transnational solidarity as a dialectical project. This is Friedman's method too, acknowledging what she has learned even when she finds the lesson insufficient, misguided, or simply unfinished. Friedman's scholarship so often involves a rich combination of new examples, new methods, and new interpretation. But it is all made possible through a critical practice rooted in accretion, comparison, and purposeful self-education. That is why I've called it dialectical. Readers of her scholarship will be familiar with strategies such as literary pairing, multiplying methodologies, and the way she gathers, clarifies, sums up, and disaggregates approaches. She creates new networks of literary culture, teaching and explaining materials in relation to each other, integrating new versions, drawing in scholarship both immediately near and far afield, establishing conversations we didn't have before, organizing our ideas, laying out expansively where we are and where we might go. Well beyond those essays on Alice Walker and Cabé Wilson, Friedman frequently turns backwards to earlier critics or to literary texts she has analyzed in the past, or to earlier versions of her own scholarship in order to move our field forward. She attributes this recursive strategy to Wilson, but it's visible throughout her own work. She collaborates with herself, revising her earlier claims, attaching new meanings to those claims, and integrating new threads. She also returns to key texts revise what she sees in them, compares them to new literary works, finds new uses, and thus borrows and renews her own work, the discipline, and the literary tradition. It strikes me that there is a profoundly sociological bent to Friedman's scholarship, which has gone largely unrecognized and was perhaps unrecognized even by her. She prompts us to ask whether words are ever possessed individually and whether individual voice is a model we wish to continue striving for. It might be, as we see in Friedman's presentation of Wilson's presentation of Walker's presentation of Woolf, that we are part of collaborations and networks that need greater visibility. My thought is that nonlinear concepts of time and literary period, which Friedman champions famously and explicitly in her penultimate book, Planetary Modernisms, lead her to uncover and emphasize histories of intellectual collaboration, what Friedman calls reshuffling, rather than histories of agonistic genius. Thinking about nonlinear time leads Friedman to thinking about more dynamic models of agency and innovation. In Planetary Modernisms and in the widely read essays she wrote in advance of the book's publication in 2015, she begins by criticizing the normative periodization of modernism and modernity, generally understood as 1890 to 1950 in North America and Western Europe. She argues that the temporal boundaries of modernism reinforce spatial, linguistic, cultural, and geopolitical boundaries. The boundaries imply, she continues, that modernist literature and art, appearing outside these ambits, especially works that come later, are lesser or less innovative because belated and dependent. The temporal boundaries also imply, she argues, that North America and Western Europe have been the only locus of modernity. Let's pause for a moment to see how she puts it. I do object, she writes, to the way such terms as alternative, other, peripheral, and even divergent reinstate Western modernity as the center, with all the other modernities as marginal or derivative. A planetary aesthetics of modernism needs to be transformative rather than merely additive. Naming a period bookends time. Friedman's concern is the derogation of later writing and the presumption that creativity is bookended by periodization, place, or even authorship. A planetary aesthetics of modernism needs to be transformative rather than merely additive. It is this transformative principle that we see in the intellectual models she collates and analyzes in her earlier work, the rewriting, the remaking, the principle that new ideas are created through imaginative as well as active collaboration, rather than the assumption that collaboration always follows the agency of the individual or is supplementary to it. Other modernist scholars and readers of Friedman's work, both admiring and critical, have focused on her theories of modernity, modernism, and historical change. But I want to highlight instead a different thread. How do new ideas enter the world? How might feminist writing about the production of feminist writing help us answer that question? Friedman argues that rethinking when and where modernism begins will allow us to acknowledge a much more diffuse, more entangled history of intellectual labor and accomplishment. And I'm persuaded by that. But as I take a moment to reflect, startled by Susan's death and the destruction of our party, I ask myself, what if it's the other way around? What if Friedman's emphasis on collaboration was the cause rather than the effect of her thinking about planetarity and the planetarity of modernism? Collaboration changes our sense of origin. It puts achievement out of joint. Feminist collaboration describes not only the process, but also the source of Friedman's ideas, and that is a lesson for us today. Susan Friedman's final book, which she had nearly completed when she died, will be published as Sisters of Scheherazade. It's not focused on Virginia Woolf, although references to Woolf appear a handful of times in the manuscript. Rather, it is a book about contemporary Muslim women's writing and about the author's effort to remediate her ignorance about contemporary Muslim women's writing. It is also a book about the figure of Scheherazade, whom Friedman describes as a spirit of transnational feminism, a legendary figure for Muslim feminists because she keeps other women safe through her gifts as a learned and suspenseful storyteller. For Friedman, Scheherazade represents a principle of feminist creativity in the face of violence, patriarchy, and authoritarianism. Friedman is interested in how Muslim women have used storytelling both to save and to shape their lives. And she's interested in how they have deployed the figure of the storyteller, Scheherazade, in both common and disparate ways. Part of the goal of the book is to integrate religion into theories of feminist intersectionality. But the book also serves as a clarion call for the work of the humanities, whose significance, impact, and contributions to knowledge have continue to need assertion, and Susan felt she could rise to that occasion. She writes, Sisters of Scheherazade affirms the ways of knowing driven by the imagination, fantasy, suspense, and empathy affirms the ways of knowing driven by imagination, fantasy, suspense, and empathy are vital accomplishments to knowledge generated in the social sciences, history, and philosophy. She asks, can fiction save us from the myriad forms of unjust captivity and rule as Scheherazade did the women of her kingdom? She answers, surely not alone. But fiction has a role to play in our salvation and our search for new freedoms. Susan's final book is about encountering ignorance and bringing new knowledge to light. It's about the effects of receiving stories as well as the effects of telling them. Scheherazade's storytelling forestalls death and animates care. It inspires the agency and storytelling of other women. Susan locates the inspiration for her project in a tradition far from her own background, but she also places the experience of Muslim women and the oral and print tradition of Muslim cultures at the center of contemporary women's writing. Sisters is a testament to Susan's self-education and to the project of listening. Those who listen, rather than simply hear, are transformed, and those who listen provide storytelling's necessary condition. You can't tell stories by yourself. Listening is therefore collaborative rather than simply passive, and the poems, novels, and short stories Friedman analyzes, however they may exist in print, draw on the sisterhood of Scheherazade to conscript the imagined space of intimate, embodied communication. In the humanities, we know about communication. In the fields of literature and languages, we study words, and we teach students how to think, how to argue, how to refute, how to clarify, and how to create with words. Friedman's statements in Sisters highlight the contributions of the humanities to ways of knowing and ways of imagining, and thus to provoking and shaping individual empathy and common purpose in a just and equitable world. I agree that the humanities are urgent for these reasons. However, there can be no collectivity without translation, no action without history, no voice without echo, no achievement without the labor of many hands and the capacity to integrate the knowledge we don't have as well as the knowledge we do. It is not a matter of one discipline against another. It is rather a matter of recognizing how basic research across the rich array of human disciplines prepares the groundwork for discoveries, ideas, and purposes we don't yet know. As we see in Susan's final work, collaborative ideas are profoundly social. Survival creates new opportunities and obligations for creativity. These are lessons from the history of feminist labor and from the history of women's writing and women's storytelling. Susan Friedman welcomed me into this history. She held me as a friend. She reshuffled my ideas, and she offered me the opportunity to reshuffle hers. I am still reshuffling. It is a gift.
This podcast is powered by the European Union and the Central European University Library.